Welcome to the third video of this masterclass for web and product managers. This is Shane Diffley. In the previous lesson you learned about a practical new framework for web governance and how you can use it as a model for organizing a better system of online control. In this video then we're going to delve into the framework in more detail to discover the elements from which it's composed. This will give you the confidence you need to deploy it in a hands-on way when planning a new approach to online management. First, we'll examine the concept of scale that lies at the heart of web governance to learn how it works and about the three key parameters upon which it is built: complexity, size, and engagement. Second, we'll see why these measures in particular are so useful for predicting the type of supervision that's suitable for an online venture, and also show how you can use them to benchmark your system against peers. And finally, we'll take a brief look at the many sub-elements from which the primary activities and resources of governance are composed, and see how these often emerge as standalone disciplines as scale increases. To get the most from this video, I recommend that you first complete lessons 1 and 2 in order to be familiar with basic concepts. You should also note that, for the purpose of simplicity, I'll be using the term website as a broad stand-in for any type of online product or service, whether intranet, social network, app, or more, as the same general concepts can be applied across the board. So if you're now ready, let's get going. As we learned in the previous video, the framework of web governance may be thought of as a conceptual model, similar to other models like the 4 Ps of marketing or Porter's 5 forces. That is, it simplifies what could otherwise be an impenetrably complex array of operational factors into 2 straightforward groupings: activity and resource. And secondly, and perhaps more usefully, it also has built-in predictive qualities, whereby, based on a measure of what we call scale, you can foresee the configuration of management that's appropriate for your circumstances. As a quick reminder, the way this works is, first, you measure the scale of an online presence using the 3 underlying characteristics of complexity, size, and engagement. Then, based on this measure, you calculate how granular the 4 primary activities will become, that is, how detailed they'll be and how frequently they'll occur. And finally, with this insight to hand, you can determine how sophisticated the supporting resources must be, and thus predict how to organize your management system. This includes staffing, the skills you'll need, what tools to buy, and more. Of course, the big question is how such simple metrics as complexity, size, and engagement can lead to such a useful prediction. Indeed, why these 3 elements at all? Why not others? Let's take these questions together. The reason these measures have been chosen is because of the direct effect they have on the overall load of management. For instance, and as we'll see in depth in a few moments, as an online service gets bigger, busier, and more complex, each of the 4 primary activities necessarily becomes more detailed and occurs more frequently, thus increasing your burden. To cope with this burden, essential resources like manpower, tools, budgeting, and more must expand and be professionally supervised. Or, to put it another way, their sophistication must grow. Hence, we see there is a direct line between the parameters of scale and your management approach. Of course, more parameters could probably be added to this model. As a matter of fact, I recommend you bring as much insight to bear during planning as possible. The more you know, the more accurate your projections will be. For example, some additional ingredients I routinely include, but which are not explicitly referenced in the framework, are those of language, geographic location, as well as ambition. By which I mean it's no good designing a system for a web service as it exists today. If your organization's ambition is to double its scale within 12 months, that needs to be known at the beginning. Nevertheless, the 3 parameters of complexity, size, and engagement do provide a good baseline for predicting an overall configuration of governance because of the influence they have on your management burden. This can be further demonstrated by the way each reflects a major part of operations. For example, the factor of complexity is representative of everything connected with the technical foundations of a product, including hosting and other technology. The parameter of size embodies the content layer, that is, all the things we create and make available to intended audiences. And finally, we have the engagement layer, in which we examine how products are used, shared, or otherwise interacted with by visitors. Hence, we see that by triangulating from just 3 key parameters, we can produce quite accurate estimates about the management needed to support your online venture. But of course, the usefulness of this model relies on our ability to isolate each factor and extract meaningful data. To learn how to do so, let's now explore each parameter more closely within the archetype of various typical websites to highlight the measures you'll need to track, starting with the bottommost or foundational layer of the concept of scale: complexity. Complexity is a measure of the sophistication of the content and other technologies used on a site, including hosting. It encompasses everything from the components of architecture, such as servers, databases, and security, to the software used to support delivery, like CMS, search, and e-commerce. This parameter has a powerful effect on management load because, as a site grows in technical intricacy, it inevitably requires more detailed and frequent oversight, which then demands more highly skilled staff, expensive tools, funding, and more. In terms of measuring the complexity of an online venture, you should envisage a broad spectrum from, at one end, a simple web server, right through to a highly sophisticated multi-tier architecture with layers of failover, redundancy, load balancing, and every other fancy piece of kit from the webmaster's cookbook. But don't worry if you don't understand these techie terms. It's not that important. All you need to be cognizant of are the differences between sites of various complexity, and from that be able to make a judgment about the impact on your administrative burden. A useful way to think of this is to sort everything into 3 layers, where each step up represents enough of a change to have a discernible effect on how you'll configure a governance solution. Of course, gradations exist between these levels, but for the purpose of simplicity we choose just 3. In the first group we have that most basic type of site, often referred to as brochureware. Its unsophisticated nature means that it can only be hosted information in plain text, with some images and downloads, but little or no interactivity. A jack-of-all-trades type webmaster with broad skills can easily look after such an operation. A good example of a brochureware site is the one managed by Junior for Mom and Pop's Diner, as seen in Lesson 2. It is nothing fancy, simply opening hours and special offers. One step up from brochureware we have what we term a dynamic site. Content on such a site is typically stored in a database and published using technology like a content management system, or pages coded with a server-side scripting language such as PHP. Although dynamic sites often include elements of interactivity and may appear quite advanced, they are actually limited in scope and off-the-shelf do not allow things like login or shopping carts. Nevertheless, the nature of their software means that staff with somewhat specialist skills are required for upkeep. And finally, at the top of the scale, we have transactional websites. A transactional site is one that embraces the full gamut of web technology. That is, everything we've encountered so far, plus personalization, login, e-commerce, and more. As we know, the very largest such operations, for example Megacorp, a firm with a global footprint, are extremely complex. Inevitably, this demands a sophisticated governance response, with lots of highly skilled IT people using advanced tools, informal teams, and massive budgets. As an aside, we should remember that complexity of this type is not restricted to the public web. Many intranets, and apps too, can be considered transactional because of the advanced interactivity they deliver, including timesheets and expense submissions. And similarly, we need to be conscious that not every transactional website is massive in size, or indeed every brochureware site tiny. There is no rule against having a huge basic site, or a complex site with a limited audience. It's simply that setups like this are generally unwieldy. Furthermore, it's frequently the case that growth in complexity almost always follows expansion in content volumes, which leads us nicely into our next parameter, size. But here's a catch. Just how do you measure the size of a website? Is it a count of the number of pages it has? What about videos and podcasts? Maybe it's the length of these recordings, or their size in megabytes. In fact, none of these is satisfactory. Although page count represents a logical baseline, a site with tens of thousands of pages could easily be created from just a handful of CMS templates, with each containing only a few words of text. Rather, the best way to assess size is to make an assessment of the frequency and volume of content, design, or code updates to a site, with a known set of core file types, including pages, videos, podcasts, etc., and from that to arrive at a measure of the total effort, recorded in full-time equivalents, needed to expedite related operations, from production to maintenance. The benefit of this approach is that it is agnostic. It does not bias towards one type of project over another. For instance, a site that produces low volumes of complex content, video or audio, could be labeled large in size in the same way as one with high volumes of more basic content, text or PDFs. They are both large because the effort that goes into producing and maintaining core content on each is equivalent. That said, estimating production for things like video or audio is so involved, while plain text is so straightforward, that a simple page count remains the preferred proxy when scoping most sites. With that in mind, and based on evidence from a variety of operations, the following broad measures are suggested for the parameter of size, using as a standard unit the effort needed to produce a single page of textual content. As before, these measures are sorted into 3 layers, with each step representing enough of a difference to have a meaningful effect on load, and thus on governance configuration. As an aside, the basis of my standard unit is that it takes one full-time author between 5 to 7 hours to produce a brand new page of textual content of plus or minus 700 words. This estimate accords well with the views of respected guru Jerry McGovern, who speculates that the average writer can create anything between 250 to 500 pages per year. You'll learn more about these rules of thumb in the second part of the masterclass when we discuss manpower planning in more detail. In the meantime, visit my personal site at diffley.com to download a free content production calculator that allows you to explore estimates for production effort. In the first layer then, we have that most ubiquitous of undertakings, the small site. This really is at the tiniest end of the scale. An online presence of this type generates low volumes of not more than 20 pages per week of straightforward updates to a site that already has between 100 to 1,000 pages, such that everything can be managed by one or at most two full-time equivalents. Next, we have a mid-sized site. This can represent quite a leap in terms of volume and complexity, wherein lots more is created, say 100 to 125 units per week, for a site of between 5 to 7,500 web pages, though this count may be lower if production effort is also allocated to alternate formats, such as video or audio. Nevertheless, volumes are such that about 4 to 8 full-time equivalents are often required. And finally, we have the daddy of them all, the large site. There truly is no limit at this end of the scale. A measure of the content volumes created by major organizations suggests multiple thousands of man-days being invested each year. By way of illustration, in 2014, the UK government announced that its newly restructured web presence was now home to more than 120,000 pages, along with many other formats. A quick reckoning on my calculator shows that, in theory, this would require the equivalent of 86,000 man-days, or 346 man-years of effort, an enormous sum. Not surprisingly, many organizations share publishing throughout the enterprise by requiring staff to update their own sections using a CMS or content management system as part of a distributed maintenance model. For instance, as well as its core team of 80 full-time editors, the UK government also relies on more than 1,000 staff to keep everything up to date, which, as you might expect, creates its own coordination challenges and is something we'll explore more of in part 2 of the masterclass. Anyway, such a huge organization aside, about 10 full-time equivalents who add hundreds of updates per week to a site that already has tens of thousands of pages is pretty commonplace for a large presence. Needless to say, these figures of manpower do not mean a web team must hire, for example, 10 people, but rather that it takes the equivalent effort of 10 people working full-time for everything to be done. What often happens is that writers or other alternate content producers are hired on a short-term basis to meet particular needs, for example in the run-up to busy periods like Christmas. Which reminds us that the real driver for all these exertions is the hope that customers will actually visit and interact with your site, which leads us nicely into the third and final layer of the concept of scale, engagement. Engagement is fundamentally a measure of the busyness of an online service, principally its traffic and levels of social interaction, including feedback, comments, ratings, shares, tweets, likes, and more. Engagement is included as a parameter of scale because, as a site grows in busyness, it inevitably has to deal with increasing numbers of queries and general issues of upkeep. In this way, it has a strong influence on the burden of management. For example, consider a busy news site that encourages interaction with its content. Its web team will have to devote substantial time to moderating comments, replying to feedback, responding to tweets, reading out trolls, and a lot more. And this will only increase as it gains in popularity. Ideally, the best way to rank engagement across the internet would be to track the total number of interactions every site receives per visitor and per visit, and then compare that to a global mean. While some organizations do publish useful stats in this area, particularly in local and national government, non-profits like NAMI in the US, as well as various universities, perhaps inevitably it's difficult to get all the data needed to create a global standard. And yet, by combining the statistics that are available, including those from Google Trends and Nielsen, together with industry experience, a series of broad measures can be suggested that are characteristic of a European national scale or US state-scale enterprise. To that end, the reference metric I use is a count of the number of unique or repeat visitors a site receives within a 1-month period, based on the assumption that each visitor also comments, shares, or likes, or as the jargon goes, converses, amplifies, or applauses, an average of once per visit. Again, these measures can be sorted into 3 layers, with each step representing enough of a change to have an effect on governance planning. As an aside, if you're confused by any of the terms I've been using, you can relax. They're extremely well explained by renowned analytics guru Avinash on his personal site at kaushik.net. First then, we have a low engagement site, which may log anything up to about 75,000 unique visitors per month, though many record much lower traffic than that. Stepping up to the mid-level sees us leap to between 150,000 to 1 million visitors per month. Many mid to large-scale corporates, non-profits, and regional government sites fit this category. And finally, we have the high engagement sites, which register above roughly 1.75 million visitors per month, though as we know, many go far, far higher. So now that we know how to isolate and make measurements for each of the parameters of scale, our next step is to find out how to use them in order to make predictions for management setup. As we've seen, each parameter may be roughly divided into 3 levels, and so it is tempting to imagine how all sites can be classified into one of 3 groups. That is, a small-scale site being small in size, low in engagement, and low in complexity, through to a large-scale site being large in size, high in engagement, and high in complexity. And to be sure, that's what we see in many cases, but not always. Again, there is no law that says each of these parameters must grow at the same rate. Indeed, it's common to find sites of mixed scale, where one or two of the factors differs greatly from that of the third, with a consequent influence on governance format. For example, consider the Gaelic language version of the Scottish Parliament website. It's essentially a mirror of the English language service, containing large volumes of content in Scottish Gaelic and based on a complex architecture. But as a corollary of targeting a minority group, the levels of traffic it generates are much lower. Thus we see that although it scores very highly on size and complexity, it's very quiet as regards engagement. We can predict, therefore, that the systems, including manpower, needed for moderating feedback, online commentary, and other interactions, are much lower than for the English site, meaning its governance is also less onerous. In a similar vein, consider Skyscanner.net. Skyscanner uses highly complex technology to deliver airline schedules to a large audience in multiple languages and currencies, and yet the amount of original publishing done by Skyscanner itself appears to be quite low. The vast majority of content is automatically generated. What this suggests is that, although Skyscanner has a large manpower requirement for technical, coding, and other services, it needs far fewer staff for content production than seen on a typical mid to large-scale site. But although there are many examples of such mixed-scale ventures, as a rule of thumb it is useful to describe a site as either small, medium, or large in scale, for a couple of reasons. First, applying such straightforward categories allows us to arrive at almost immediate predictions for online management, based on the by now well-understood effects of scale on activity and resource. That is, if we discover a site that is large in scale, we know pretty much instantly the granularity of its operational activity will be very high, and will therefore require sophisticated resourcing to support its management burden. This includes a large headcount, specialist skills, well-defined roles, formal teams, complex tools, a bigger budget, and more. And second, a consistent set of measures for describing sites, whatever their industry, can reveal commonalities in approach that would otherwise remain obscure. For example, it's often assumed that the online experience of organizations in sectors as discrete as, say, retail and non-profit are so dissimilar that no useful comparisons can be made. But this is far from the truth. Using the concept of scale, we can look beyond such differences and observe parallels that arise purely as a result of their size, complexity, and engagement. In a sense, it doesn't matter that one site is non-profit and the other retail. If the scale of their operations are the same, they will face largely equivalent governance challenges and therefore arrive at comparable solutions. For instance, let's take 2 websites I'm familiar with from the UK. One is Macmillan, a leading cancer charity, and the other BHS, a high street retailer. Both can be judged as about mid to large in scale in terms of the British market. That is, despite some differences, they both deploy complex technology with large volumes of content and attract well over 1 million visitors per month. Putting aside the fact that they have different objectives and serve very different audiences, their similarity in scale suggests that they both contend with comparable governance challenges. That is, both need to supervise highly granular activity by ensuring sophisticated resources are put in place. As a result, it would be no surprise to discover if they both adopt an analogous approach as regards staffing, skills, tools, and technology, as well as overall funding. This ability to compare across industries represents an added benefit of the concept of scale. It means that if you're looking to benchmark your governance system, you're not restricted to looking at peers alone. The net can be broadened. The only thing that matters is that the scale of operations be the same, because products of matching scale have similar challenges, no matter what they're about. This consistency is further demonstrated by the point that, as scale increases from small to medium to large, the high-level categories of activity and resource remain absolutely constant and never change, no matter what business you're in or what your site is about. The only difference is in the granularity and sophistication by which they are expedited. In practical terms, this means that as scale grows, each task within the top-level activities of governance will, over time, emerge as a distinct discipline as size, complexity, and engagement increase. up to the point that at some stage they will demand their own dedicated resource to support them. Let's take a simple example to show what I mean. As we know, the task of design happens on pretty much all websites. On a small-scale site, like for Mom and Pop's Diner, new designs are needed only very occasionally, and the standard to be met is not so high. This means that a web guy with about average skills, like our Webmaster Junior, can respond to most requests, simply by knocking something up in Photoshop. That's how small-scale sites operate, as a one-man band. But let's fast forward a few years. Maybe Mom and Pop has grown into a regional giant, and as a consequence its online presence has also expanded. Design work is still needed, but now much more frequently, in larger volumes and of greater complexity. It's clear that Junior will no longer have the time or the skills to do everything. As a consequence, he needs to hire a new full-time specialist to help out, give her a formal role as a UX designer, acquire all the specialist tools she needs to do her job, and establish the standards and processes to be adhered to. What's happening here is that management sophistication is responding to a growth in granularity. Although overall the broad categories of operations haven't changed, as scale has increased, the subtask of design has begun to occur with enough frequency and in enough detail to emerge as a standalone discipline in its own right, requiring its own support. And that's just one subtask. The same change can occur for almost every one of the other 20+ sub-elements within governance. To see how, let's dig, at last, into the 4 primary activities and resources of the governance framework, to reveal a complete list of the sub-elements from which they're composed, starting with the activity at the coalface of operations, maintenance. As an aside, if you think you'd benefit from a more complete description of each of the elements, I recommend you download a copy of the Website Manager's Handbook, now available for free on my personal site at diffley.com. I wrote the handbook particularly for web and product managers with little experience of operations, and it provides a good introduction to each of the tasks within this area. Anyway, carrying on. Maintenance comprises all the tasks needed to ensure the operational, day-to-day integrity of a site or other online product. In other words, it's about making sure a service can run smoothly and according to plan, and is composed of 6 elements. These are publishing, quality assurance, engagement monitoring, performance monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, and change control. Taking the instance of a website again, as it grows in scale, it's tasks like publishing and performance monitoring that typically emerge first as distinct disciplines. Wrapped around maintenance, we have development. Development is the activity by which a new service is created, or significant changes made to one already in use. For example, adding a major new section of content to a website. Typically, development is what forms the core responsibility for web and product managers, and requires close coordination among many specialists, as well as detailed analysis of user and business needs. Timescales of anything between 4 weeks to 18 months are common for such work, though as we'll see, new techniques like Agile can decrease these periods. There are 8 standard subtasks within development, some of which overlap with similar areas of maintenance. These are planning, content, design, build, testing, hosting, release and publicity, and finally review. As seen on many projects, the disciplines that tend to emerge first and attract the majority of resourcing, particularly in terms of manpower, are core skill areas like content, design, and code. Moving on. At the head of the table, and presiding over the activities of maintenance and development, we have leadership. While frequently upstaged by more visible aspects of administration, this represents the true center of power on a digital project. The objective of leadership is to ensure a controlled approach to management, from planning and design through to maintenance and infrastructure. Without leadership, there is no one to say what is or is not allowed. Ultimately, this means no control and no direction, which is sadly common on many sites, and is something we'll be exploring more in the next video. The subtasks within the remit of leadership are: first, to set online strategy and specify KPIs. Second, to set web policy, standards, and rules. Third, to establish all necessary resourcing, in particular funding. And fourth, to approve and monitor activity, to ensure everything contributes to overall objectives. Few, if any, of these leadership subtasks emerge as distinct disciplines. Rather, they may be shared by a web product manager with a steering group or a senior management team. And finally, providing a secure foundation for all online operations is infrastructure. The purpose of infrastructure is to plan, and sometimes build, the hosting and other architecture needed to support a web presence. In this regard, it encompasses 4 subtasks: architecture selection, architecture management, performance management, and data and security management. On many small to mid-scale sites, this entire category of activity is now outsourced, simply because hosting is such a commodity service. So that covers all the subtasks within the primary activities of governance. Now let's take a quick look at the elements contained within the 4 resources, though you should note that a far more detailed analysis of each follows in part 2 of this masterclass. First, we have what is to my mind the most important of all, people. I say this because hire good people and they'll generally find clever and innovative ways to get maximum bang for your buck, no matter what other resourcing is available. There are 4 sub-elements to consider here. First, manpower. This covers how many full-time equivalents you'll need to expedite your total management load. And remember, this may not equate to actual team size, but to total effort, some of which may be shared throughout the enterprise or hired on contract. Secondly, we have skills, or the expertise your people will need and to what level. Third is roles and responsibilities, or how you plan to allocate duties, such that everything is covered and no one is treading on anyone's toes. And finally, we have teams. That is, the way in which you structure reporting lines so that effective oversight can be maintained. Such is the importance of this resource of people that we'll spend a long time exploring it in a later video, including how to bring staff with you during the difficult process of governance change. Following people, we have the category of process, which is composed of the sub-elements, policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines, which together describe how we do things around here. What typically happens is that as scale increases, so too does the need for operational formality. Official policies then emerge which establish a global approach for online, which is in turn translated into standards, procedures, and guidelines that set out the practices to be followed, and which can be audited in the event of errors. Of course, good processes are about more than just documenting how things are done, but in actually making them happen. To this end, the widespread adoption of new techniques, in particular Agile, is helping teams deliver ever better experiences at a faster pace and a lower cost, and is again something you can learn more about in part 2 of the masterclass. Next, we have tools. This category represents all the technology, systems, software, and other supports a team needs to do its job. This might include anything from Photoshop for a designer through to an entire enterprise-wide content management system. Again, as the scale of operations intensifies, tools become progressively more specialist in order to support specialist staff, as well as progressively more expensive. Indeed, as we'll see in the next lesson, the sheer range of tools now available to support online management makes this one of the most dynamic and interesting areas of governance development. And finally, we have the overall category of budget, which really stands by itself. In a sense, budget encompasses everything we've already mentioned, because without funding, nothing can happen. No staff can be hired, no tools purchased, and no work undertaken. In many organizations, budget is broken down into the sub-elements of salaries, software, and other, which accounts for things like contractors, publicity, and other things. Needless to say, as scale grows, so too must funding. There is only so much that can be done on the basis of wishful thinking. As explained in the next video, eventually somebody somewhere has to sign a check. So by this point, you've learned almost all there is to know about scale and the governance framework. As such, we can begin to query the predictions the model can make for what a real management system may look like, as an organization grows from small to medium to large. Unfortunately, no turnkey solution has yet been created that will work in every instance. Nevertheless, a commonality of experience among long-standing teams does suggest patterns that can at least be used as a starting point. With that in mind, let's now see what these might look like for websites of varying scale, starting with our favorite small-scale enterprise, Mom and Pop's Diner. As we know, the scale of this operation is very small. It contains just simple brochureware content hosted on a basic web server, with visitors per month in the low thousands, and few if any interactions. As a consequence, the management load is awfully light, and activity of low granularity. This means that the resulting resourcing and governance systems need not be very sophisticated. Such a small-scale site can easily be run by a single web guy with mid-level skills, perhaps as we've seen Mom and Pop's son, Junior, working part-time, following informal procedures and using readily available freeware tools. Now let's jump to the far end of the spectrum and contrast Mom and Pop with its opposite number, Megacorp. A measure of Megacorp's online presence reveals a highly complex architecture with multiple layers of failover and redundancy, oodles of content on many platforms, millions of visitors, and all engaging in commentary and other sharing. The administrative load in this operation cannot be understated. We can rightly predict that each of its 4 governance activities will be highly granular, with almost all subtasks emerging as distinct disciplines requiring sophisticated individual support. This inevitably demands large numbers of staff with well-defined roles and specialist skills, organised into structured teams using expensive tools, following formal procedures, and supported by a large budget. In practical terms, we're talking about dozens of people arranged into regional teams, coordinated by numerous web and product managers, perhaps with the assistance of a centralised digital support unit, which itself provides necessary expertise and other resourcing, whilst also policing online development. And finally, let's land somewhere in the middle, somewhere between these two extremes, and explore a mid-scale site of, say, an average American city. For example, the city of Adair, Kentucky, population 800,000, which has been online for a good many years. Although its website contains a lot of information and gets good volumes of traffic and engagement, it does not yet allow for many complex transactions. In terms of scale, it can be identified as a dynamic site, about mid-sized, with an average of 125,000 unique visitors per month. This represents a heavy but not overwhelming load. Some of its governance activities are undeniably quite granular, in particular content and publishing, though most less so. In terms of a resourcing and governance approach, a team of 3 to 5 full-time equivalents, including an online communications coordinator, a couple of developers, a writer, and a half-time designer, could likely look after everything. And with that happy scene in mind, let's bring this lesson to a close. By this stage, you should have a much broader appreciation of the governance framework, in particular the concept of scale, which lies at the heart of so much planning. Indeed, you should be able to classify any online presence as regards its size, complexity, and engagement, and from that predict, at least an outline, how its management may look. Usefully, this allows you to benchmark your site, not only against peers, but against any organization, so long as it shares the same characteristics of scale. And yet, useful and all as this is, the true work of governance still lies ahead. While you may now understand the theory upon which administration is built, the real test starts as you begin to apply this knowledge in the real world to examine whether the systems you actually have in place are capable of delivering stability, or if not, what needs to change. To find out how, in our next video, we'll examine the key indicators you can use to gauge the suitability and performance of any system of web or product management, as well as a method for auditing and isolating issues that could threaten success. You'll also see how to draw on this evidence in order to create a renewed vision for governance and compile a business case that compels senior executives to act. Thanks for watching. Remember, for lots of additional insights as well as free downloads, visit my website at diffley.com.